I claim that there is no housing shortage. How do I know this? Because you can compare the supply to the demand. And if you look, you'll see that there's essentially about a 10% vacancy rate. In other words, 10%. The census tracks the number of available homes and the number of households. And if you do that, you'll see that the number of available homes exceeds the number of households, and there's essentially a 10% vacancy rate. So you might say, well, okay, well then how? Obviously, there's no shortage. How is there a shortage? Well, the so-called experts and the activists say that the vacancy rate of 10% is not sufficient. It should be 12%. And they say, and therefore we're short about 1 million homes, and that's where the shortage comes from.
Revolution of common sense.
Revolution of common sense.
A revolution of common sense.
Truth was once common sense, but today truth is uncommon. Explore biblical truths around faith, business, and politics with Peter Demas. Uncommon sense in current times.
Hey folks, welcome to Uncommon Sense in Current Times. Today I am with Dan Huff. He served as the General Deputy Assistant Secretary for Enforcement at the Department of Housing and Urban Development. He also later was a senior advisor, and both of these were during President Trump's first term. He was a graduate of Columbia Law School. He's done works with the Wall Street Journal, Politico, Fox News, Los Angeles Times. He's now in the private sector where he sits on a couple of boards, including a member of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum Board in Washington, D.C. So, Dan, it's an honor for you to be here. I appreciate you being here today.
It's an honor to be here with you and your listeners. Thanks for having me.
So, a reason why we're here to discuss is you wrote an article that I read on Fox News back in September of 25, where you state that DEI is the real cause of America's housing crisis. Am I summarizing that correctly? And if so, can you kind of frame how you got to that real briefly?
Sure. It's, when you talk about how something gets to you, sometimes you have an idea in you and you feel like you've got to get it out. And I don't want to go too far with it, but I almost feel like I've got this prophecy inside me and I have to preach it. It's not really a prophecy, but it's more sort of technical knowledge from my time on Capitol Hill. And what we have here is people talking very loudly about there being a housing crisis, a housing shortage. We got to do this. We got to do that. And I felt if you really look into the numbers, and we can get into this more a little bit later, you see that in fact it's a hoax. There is no shortage once you consider the current number of vacancies, what the normal vacancy rate should be, the population growth declining, deportations increasing, and just general building numbers. So then I thought, well, if there really is no housing shortage, why are people saying this? And that's where you come into the DEI, because it's a convenient excuse for saying we have to change the rules of the way people live, the zoning laws in particular, in order to essentially socially engineer how communities look. That's what the left is really after in pushing this narrative, and that's really behind a lot of what we're hearing today.
So I'm curious because I live in I won't call it a suburb. It's a separate city. It's 120,000, 150,000 people outside of Nashville, Tennessee. And so it would obviously be different here than, say, New York, Chicago, places like that. Did you account for regional differences? Because I notice the numbers you bring up all seem to be kind of on a national level. But is it possible there's a housing crisis in certain areas and not in other areas?
It's absolutely possible that in particular regions demand exceeds supply and prices go up. But the market takes care of that by making things cheaper elsewhere and people moving. For example, I'm out on the East Coast. I live in Jersey. I'd love to live in Manhattan. It's too expensive. That's why I live in Jersey. So yes, it is possible that some places are very high. And that's really the point of the opening of the article, where I said the people who are complaining about this are basically arguing, why doesn't Hermes, the top fashion line, just create more Birkin bags and then everyone can have them? The whole reason that people want them is because it's exclusive. People will always want to live in particular places. And if one place gets sort of too common, they'll want to live in the next exclusive place. And so you're really never solving any problem by building. So you are correct. There are areas that are more desirable than others, and those places are high, but the market has a solution. What you do is people move to other areas where they can afford better. Those places start to build up, and the places that had high demand, the demand starts to fall, then prices start to fall. So we sort of, in general, apply free market principles to everything, and it works pretty well, and it will work well here. My article addresses nationally, you are correct that in certain areas things could be a little bit different. But again, there is a well-proven, well-worn means of addressing those shortages, and that is the market expanding to other places and things moving to equilibrium.
Now, this is anecdotal, so and I recognize the weakness of the source that I'm giving you on this, but I'm in the restaurant business. I have a lot of employees, and right now, currently, I have more homeless employees than I've ever had. And it's always an issue when you're dealing with the restaurant business. You always have some of those issues that are there. And the reason I see it is because with mortgage interest rates jumping up, but also it's just other apartments that are buying, that have to build with it. They're borrowing money. They're borrowing money at a higher interest. And so the rates of even apartments in the area have gone up, and so much of it has gone up that many people, and we pay well above minimum wage. It's not like these are minimum wage employees. We pay double minimum wage for a lot of our staff. So, but they're still finding places that are not affordable. I have kids that live in Birmingham or lived in Birmingham and Auburn, Alabama, another two, again, kind of smaller areas, and they struggled finding apartments that was affordable for them. Could this not be maybe a DEI issue as opposed to an affordability issue because of the interest rates that skyrocketed after 2020?
So I think that you're pointing to a number of economic factors that are relevant. There's no question that the high interest rates, for example, are contributing to the difficulty in getting mortgages. So yes, there are other effects, but those things tend to sort of ebb and flow, right? So they go up and down. And yes, right now things are more difficult in situations that you describe where people can't afford their own places. Maybe they'll have roommates, maybe they'll double up, maybe they'll live further away. So those are essentially things that fluctuate to and fro. What I'm really focused on is this overarching attack on zoning, because what you've seen in a lot of the writings and the discussion is this idea that we have to eliminate zoning laws. And that's where I'm focused. The factors you mentioned are true, but they're sort of, they've always been here and they tend to go up and down. The thing that's new now, and this is where the DEI comes in, is this full frontal assault on the idea of zoning. There is a reason that Washington, D.C. looks different than New York. If you've been there, New York, skyscrapers, lots of people. D.C., it seems more like a small town. And the reason is there's a cap on how high you can build buildings. So zoning is really important for maintaining the character of a community. And a lot of times that means single family zoning. And what they want to really do is they want to get rid of that to build high density, often low income zoning in suburban areas, which brings a host of problems and at a minimum sort of changes the character of the community, costs more money and resources. And there's a reason why things are zoned for single family. And that is what's really being attacked here. People are saying there's a housing shortage, therefore we need to eliminate zoning. This was something that the Obama administration tried to do. The Biden administration was after it, and I dealt with a lot when I was at the White House and also prior to that at HUD, and we actually put a stop to it. Biden put it back in. The current Secretary of HUD is outstanding. Scott Turner, he's gotten rid of it, but now it's moved to the state level. And so, for example, in Massachusetts, where I'm from, they passed a law that basically any communities along the commuter rail line have to eliminate their zoning. And they made it seem like it was voluntary. Like if you do it, then you'll get to keep certain government funding. But ultimately it was treated as mandatory. So they marketed it to pass it as voluntary, carrot and stick. And then once they got it passed, they said, oh, no, it doesn't mean what it looks like it means. It's actually mandatory. And they're suing every locality to force them to get rid of their zoning. And that's where I'm saying the DEI comes in. Getting rid of the zoning. Why are they doing that? The reason they're doing that is because they don't like essentially the demographic makeup of the suburbs. They think they're too white. They have other problems with it. And they think the culprit here is zoning as opposed to just sort of economics where people can afford to live, where people like to live. And so what they're really after is dismantling zoning to essentially make where everybody lives conform to their DEI principles. That's what's at the bottom of it in this sort of new front of assault on zoning that comes from this claimed housing shortage. Again, the other things you've mentioned always existed. This is new.
So, interesting on the zoning piece, because again, I've lived in two cities, Nashville and Kansas City, where what you would see a phenomenon where You had almost the gentrification. You had these poor areas, and then people would come in, especially usually younger people, young professionals. They come in, they buy it, they build it up. Other places come in, they put in these little hip restaurants. The ones that always have the Edison bulbs and subway
Yes.
tile. And one-page menus, and but you see this every in the areas, and then eventually the pricing goes up.
Hmm.
But the people that were there before usually get displaced somewhere else.
Right.
How does what you are suggesting, how does that tie in with it? Does that seem to be they seem to go hand in hand for me. Is that am I accurate in that?
I mean, look, I think that the story you're telling is a common one. I mean, when my mom grew up, she told me, in a downtown area in her community, and then, prices started to go up and they moved and, kept moving out further and further out. So, yeah, I mean, that's sort of a story as old as time. It happens. And that goes back to my point that, markets have a way of ebbing and flowing and things essentially working out. And yes, like if you're on the sort of the wrong side of that, it's uncomfortable, but it's also not a national emergency that requires you to, get rid of zoning laws and replace sort of traditional economics with a top-down government-imposed framework. So I think you're pointing to correct things, but I also don't think that that really, again, is any basis for the government to come in with a heavy hand the way it is and trying to essentially tear up the way people live. I mean, one of the nice things people, aspire to is getting a good job, building a family, and then like being able to move to a suburb to a nice area. The solution isn't to like destroy all nice areas so nobody can move to one. It's to, make it someplace that, and I mentioned this in the article, like the Fair Housing Act and all these sort of discrimination laws. The original purpose of it was to make sure that people can live where they wish to and where they can afford. It was always understood that the economics is a valid basis for. There's no reason, when I lived at the White House, I wanted to live in Georgetown. I didn't get to live in Georgetown. It's too expensive. I lived somewhere else. I didn't
Right.
go and see we should get rid of all zoning laws so I can go live in Georgetown. That's sort of the point of the law is to make sure that if you're in the economic bracket that can afford to live in the Upper East Side, no one can say you can't live here because of the way you look. And that's a bad thing, and the laws have gotten rid of it, and they've done a pretty good job of preventing that. That's not the same thing as saying everyone gets to live in the Upper East Side. And that's really what they're after, and that's what I mean by DEI, and that's what they're really after with eliminating zoning.
So I've seen on the flip side of what I described about, and it's almost, but again, this is more of a natural economic occurrence than a forced economic occurrence, where you see kind of older neighborhoods. The people die out. The people that live there 25, 30 years, they die. The kids either rent the property or they sell it. And because there's new and brighter and bigger out there, then it doesn't maintain that Georgetown feel, that Manhattan feel, and so. And then eventually it becomes renters, and then it starts to kind of the neighborhood starts to turn down. Like I've seen it before. I mean, my wife and I will drive through neighborhoods, and we're like, "Oh, I remember this used to be a good neighborhood." I mean,
Yeah.
those type of images kind of come to mind. Or you have other external factors like drugs coming in, et cetera.
Sure.
Um, is that kind of the fear involved if they try to change the zoning, that there would be this change of the neighborhood, the component of the neighborhood, and run the risk of that, and then basically they're back to where they started to begin with, and then they're going to change zoning for this another area over here that became more desirable after that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's not the zoning is not simply about look and feel. It's also about the character, the type of people that are there. You have a young family, you want other families there. You don't necessarily want a bunch of college students who are single and having loud parties and up late or doing drugs or things like that. So yes, once you get rid of the single family zoning, which is really the thing they're interested in, once you get rid of that, you open the door to a lot of things happening. I mean, you hear cases where you have a suburban area and somebody wants to build like a halfway house for people coming out of prison, coming out of treatment clinics, and obviously they need to have a place to go, but that also doesn't need to be in a place where a bunch of families are living. And so that's really one of the other points of zoning, that it can change the character of the neighborhood and potentially in negative ways that people simply do not want. And it's just imagine if you're like listening to this right now and you have like a sort of a house in a suburban area. How would you like if suddenly like a big apartment building went up next door? I mean, it would definitely change things. You just think about that, and that's really what they're trying to prevent. And like, look, like anything, zoning can be abused. All right, you can point to this bad case, that bad case, but on the whole, the idea is to preserve the character, the look, and feel of a neighborhood. And you don't go out you don't get rid of something like that that's been around for a long time for good reason on the basis of essentially a fake crisis.
Haven't you noticed that low energy, brain fog, or just feeling a step slower might be creeping in after sitting for a while? It could be linked to your circulation. Blood Flow 7 by Juvenon is designed to support healthy nitric oxide levels, which help your blood vessels relax and open up. It improves your oxygen and nutrient delivery to your brain, heart, and muscles. That means better stamina, mental clarity, and overall vitality without caffeine or stimulants. It's made with clinically studied natural ingredients, and in research, these have been shown to boost nitric oxide by as much as 230% in just 3 hours, and it helps open arteries for smoother blood flow. 2 easy capsules a day. No mess, no fuss, and you're supporting heart health, healthy blood pressure, and more energy to power through. So check it out at bloodflow7.com/uncommon or click the link in the description. That's bloodflow7.com uncommon. It is common sense. Now, I know when then Senator Vance, now Vice President Vance, was running, he made the argument many times that immigration impacted this housing market as well, especially probably in certain areas that was where immigration was more concentrated on that. How does immigration play into a factor into your argument that this is kind of more fabricated from DEI, where because Vance is pretty much saying we do have a real problem and it's caused by immigration. You seem to say that the problem isn't really real; it's kind of fabricated in order to change the zoning. Both arguments could be true. I don't think they're mutually exclusive, but how do you see that?
Well, I fold the vice president's arguments into one of mine. I claim that there is no housing shortage. How do I know this? Because you can compare the supply to the demand. And if you look, you'll see that there's essentially about a 10% vacancy rate. In other words, 10%. The census tracks the number of available homes and the number of households. And if you do that, you'll see that the number of available homes exceeds the number of households, and there's essentially a 10% vacancy rate. So you might say, well, okay, well then how? Obviously, there's no shortage. How is there a shortage? Well, the so-called experts and the activists say that the vacancy rate of 10% is not sufficient. It should be 12%. And they say, and therefore we're short about 1 million homes. And that's where the shortage comes from, because any healthy market requires a certain amount of vacancies, right? If you think about unemployment,
Right.
unemployment is never zero. Someone's looking for a job. There's some churn all the time, and it's necessary to have such a churn to have a healthy functioning market. And that is true. But the question is, what is the sort of the baseline vacancy rate that's required? They claim it's 12%, is currently 10, therefore they say there's a shortage. But I went back and I looked historically. What's been the vacancy rate historically, going back to essentially 1965? And what you see is that it ranges from 8% to about 14%. So we're essentially sitting in the middle. There's no stable vacancy rate that's sort of the optimal. And so to say that 10 is bad and 12 is good, no such thing. That's what I mean when I say that there's no shortage. And a piece of that argument is that 10% is fine. It's fully within standard range. Plus, there's a number of phenomena occurring right now that are actually going to even decrease the demand for housing. One of those is what the vice president's brought up, which is people here from countries who shouldn't be here. Now, they estimate those numbers from 10 to 20 million. The number of units that even the most sort of the most aggressive estimates of the shortage are maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 million homes that we're short. Okay, so that would be entirely taken up by deporting, say, 20 million people. So and that may be part of what the vice president was saying. So the bottom line is, yes, it's an element of my argument that there's clearly not a problem to start with, and in fact, all trends are moving towards having more, needing even less houses than we do today, because population is slowing, because people are being deported, and because they're cracking down on immigration specifically. And once that's done, it's going to open up even more space.
So, going back to the specifically to the zoning, and I understand and I agree that zoning, helps preserve kind of the neighborhood standards, et cetera. You said that we. The purpose of it, as far as intentionally being exclusionary, has been solved. I know there's probably some exceptions to that somewhere, here or there. But is there a point in time do you think that there runs a risk where it's serving the community character versus perpetuating exclusion to certain groups? Because even though the buildings may be the same, it may be, again, you look at the Upper East Side of Manhattan, versus somewhere else, where that end up being exclusionary, accidentally, not intentionally, but accidentally, which could create the problem. Is that possible as well, that could happen?
Well, it's interesting, when you say accidentally, there is a sort of legal theory of what they call disparate impact, which is a situation where
Yes.
you have a rule that's on its face neutral that can disproportionately impact particular groups. The classic example that I saw at HUD was the Democrats, when they were in charge, said that if you're a landlord, you're not allowed to run a criminal background check on prospective tenants or a credit check. Why? Because those types of checks disproportionately hurt, certain minority groups, that they tend to, get flagged more often. Now, that may be true, but also, is that really unfair for a landlord not to want to have someone with a criminal background or, poor credit in his or her home? So I think that, the answer to your question is, there may be situations where things inadvertently have such impacts, but the question you have to ask yourself is, to what extent is it the job or is it the sort of moral responsibility of the government to police that? In other words, to say that there should be no disparate treatment, right? Overtly discriminating against people. Yeah, I think, most people agree with that. But how far down the hole is the government supposed to do, essentially
Right.
twisting people's arms before to say, what, if you're going that, we can't, it's not, there's a flip side to that equation, which is you're restricting people's freedom to do certain things, which in a lot of cases makes sense. Run a credit check, run a criminal background check. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, Upper East Side, your example, look, I think as long as we're saying that if you can afford to live somewhere, no one's going to say no because of rate. The fact that it will operate to exclude certain people disproportionately who don't have that kind of money, that is not a valid excuse for the government to step in and change the rules. And really, it sort of never has been in America until this sort of disparate impact idea came up, because the idea has always been equality of opportunity, not equality of result. And really, what your question gets to the heart of my point, that to say otherwise is really to say we need DEI, because at the heart of it, DEI is saying that anytime we see an outcome that doesn't match sort of the proportions we want, we have to step in. So if there's not a proportional representation in this neighborhood or that neighborhood, we've got to strip down the laws and change the rules and say no more zoning, which has existed for a long time. The same way that if they don't like the demographic makeup of a school or of a corporate board, they come in and say we're going to change the rules, change the standards, just to essentially enforce quotas on where people live. They've done it in the corporate boardrooms, they've done it in the schools, and now they want to do it in your neighborhood.
No, to be completely transparent, I'm very much against DEI. I think it's an anti-Christian principle. I've never been a fan of it, and however they couch the term affirmative action, et cetera. But I would also have to agree and acknowledge the fact that there's always been bad actors that will want to do certain things on the front side to have the negative effect on the backside. So, for example, back in the 50s in the South, the testing, the poll testing and everything, where can you read this, can you do this, and they would always find reasons to keep people from voting on it. Technically, that was a disparate impact type thing, even though the intent of it was used for discrimination. What do we have in place to prevent bad actors from taking advantage of this, but not be DEI either?
Well, I mean, I think that we have very vigorous laws in terms of housing discrimination, right? And if there's any evidence that your real motive here is you don't want a particular person in your neighborhood because of the way that person looks or certain other characteristics, there's a whole mechanism for investigating that, first administratively, then in courts, and there's very significant penalties. So I think that the government's gone quite far in eradicating root and branch direct discrimination. And as to, well, could it happen that it had an effect or somebody sort of squeaks by not providing evidence? I think the answer to that goes back to my prior point. There's a balance here because there's rights on both sides. And, you brought up the sort of the Christian aspect of it, right? Remember, when God destroys Sodom and Gomorrah and Abraham prays and says, don't do it if there's 45 righteous men, if there's 40, he goes all the way down to 10, but he stops at 10. Why does he stop at 10? Because there can be collateral damage in the pursuit of justice. At a certain point, you have to accept a certain amount of bad actors or bad result, let's say, in pursuing the greater good.
Now, I go back to 2008. We had the housing crash, and again, even though that was primarily dealing with mortgages, et cetera, but it also impacted rents and it impacted just housing in general. But that had nothing to do with DEI that created the problems with it from there. It was a legitimate, real problem. I want to make certain that you're not saying DEI is causing, you're saying DEI is actually that we don't really have a problem, but DEI advocates are trying to manufacture a problem that's not there. But like in 2008, you're not saying that DEI would have been the cause of something like that.
You correctly described my latest article in that I'm not saying that DEI,
Okay.
they're making up a fake crisis as an excuse to get rid of zoning because they have DEI aims. However, actually, I wrote another piece in Fox Opinion many years ago saying that DEI was, in fact, they didn't call it DEI then, that it was an element of the housing crash. What happened was that you had Alan Greenspan testify before Congress, and he said that they are lowering lending standards at Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which essentially control, a lot of the housing market, and
wow.
they're doing it because they do not like, there's pressure essentially to change it because they don't like the number, the demographics of who's getting loans. And they forced them to lower standards, and then we had the housing crash. And there's a lot of people talk about that. And in fact, I'll give you another example. I think it was the Fair Housing Administration, I'm not 100% sure, the FHA that came before Congress prior to the crash, and they said, hey, listen, we did this program you wanted, which is called a seller finance down payment, right? One of the big barriers to buying a home is you have to be able to have the down payment. Even if you can make the mortgage, some people can't do the down payment. The idea was let the seller give the buyer the money for the down payment and then sort of essentially load that into the mortgage, right? But the problem with that is the whole point of the down payment is to show financial stability and to make sure that the buyer has skin in the game. Anyway, what the
Right.
FHA was saying was we tried this program, which you thought would help get more minorities basically into homes. And what's going on is the default rate is skyrocketing and it's costing us a ton of money. So let us stop, please. To which the response of Congress was, don't you dare, keep doing it. And so that was coming at the same time as the Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac stuff, and they lowered a lot of the lending standards, and they were doing that, there was a profit motive, but the activists especially were trying to get people into homes who normally couldn't be in homes because they didn't like the demographics of to whom the loans were going, and we all know what happened after that. So that was an important, I claim, and I think there's a lot of evidence that there was a lot, that was in fact an element of the housing crash, unfortunately, and it's very important that we do not get into that again by, again, lowering standards in lending and in other areas of American life.
I never considered that until you just said that from here. That's a very fascinating, and I think it's a very valid argument that you're making on that. What do you going forward? Like, going forward, do you think there is a solution to when there is housing shortages? And again, like, so we started off talking about it kind of regionally. There might be something here now, like a city or something. Is there something that can be done to help with housing shortages that are more immediate? Because obviously, by the time you get building permits and you do, and you build them up and you go through that process, that can take a very long time. Are there quick fix besides lowering standards or lowering standards, whether it comes to zoning or lowering standards when it comes to lending? Are there any quick fixes that can help revitalize an area, such as maybe give tax incentives to businesses to come in an area to encourage people to go into more less desirable areas or something like that? Is there anything like that that can be done?
Well, I think a quick fix is lowering interest rates. Now, there may be reasons not to do that, having to do sort of macroeconomic, but sort of if you're looking only at the housing market, bringing down the interest rates could significantly change the calculus because some people don't want to sell their homes because they have such a they have a good interest on a good interest rate on their mortgage on their own home, and if they buy something new, they'd have to change that. So I think that would help, essentially grease the market a little so things would move, and that could be done, fairly quickly. You're certainly correct that there's a lot of different tax programs. I think counties, states have experimented with a lot of that. I was out in Colorado in sort of a resort area over the summer, And I found out that it's so expensive to live in the place that I was that a lot of like the businesses themselves kind of buy properties and then sort of subsidize the rent for their employees to live in the area. So that's something that can help in in a situation where you have workers who can't live too far away. But I think probably the quickest fixes have to do with the interest rates. A little longer term is what you say. Yes, there's tax breaks and things that can be done at the margins. But sort of the biggest problem that you can never fix is that people always want to be in the most desirable areas, and that's always why they're going to cost money. And that's just a phenomenon that's been around since the dawn of time, right?
Right. Yeah, I mean, I don't care where you are. I'm always wanting the nicer neighborhood, nicer house.
Right.
I mean, yeah. So,
I remember
yeah,
the movie Studio
I
54.
covet 2 doors down from me, actually. So,
Yeah, it's like, Studio 54, I saw the movie, like, I don't know if it's true or not, but basically there's like a line in it or something where you talk about how like it's really exclusive to get into the club. Okay, you're in the club, great. No, but there's another room, and there's a room after that. Like everywhere you are, there's something more exclusive, right? It's like it's always, you can't solve that problem by building more rooms because like it's the scarcity that makes it desirable. So you can't really
that's
solve
right.
that bottom line. Everybody wants to live in Manhattan. That's why it's expensive. So,
Well, maybe it depends on what the new mayor does there as
Very
well.
fair.
Whether everybody,
Yeah, exactly. 100% correct. Yeah, I agree with you. Fingers crossed.
Well, Dan,
Uh,
thank you so much. If there's something, how can what can people, they want to find out more about this, find out more about what you're doing and your thoughts on this? Where can they go? How can they find out more about this stuff?
so a couple of resources. I'll plug myself at Real Dan Huff on Twitter. I talk about things like this. Read that article in Fox Opinion that I wrote with Paige Brunitsky, by the way, who worked with me at HUD, and she's very sharp on a lot of this stuff. And then HUD's website now has a lot more information coming out. But I think that that's a great place to start. And and HUD has rules, regulations that kind of talk about these problems. So there's a lot going on in this. But I think you sort of following the people who are talking about it. Paige Brunitsky, who again was my colleague, you can follow me, start with the article, and there's links in the article to certain other topics, so you can kind of start your research there. I'm sorry I don't have like a greater catalog of where to begin, but frankly, there's not that many people I think who are really focused narrowly on on this problem. But that's a good start.
Well, I think if people aren't focused on this problem, it will be a problem for them to be focusing on, and
Yep.
sadly, we too often want to fight downstream. So I thank you so much. Um, I appreciate you being on the show. I do thank you, and I hope to have you back again soon.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's really, sometimes you write something, you have no idea if anybody reads it. It's really, it's an honor to me that you read it, you care about it, you recognize the importance of it, and your listeners as well. Thank you so much for having me, and look forward to talking to you again sometime soon.
All right, thank you. See you too. Bye bye.